WashingTECH.
Spectrum is a public resource. You and I own it. It's like public lands. And so, and it has to be managed, because if it wasn't managed properly, there'd be a lot of interference.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Ari Fitzgerald, partner with the law firm of Hogan Lovells, where he leads the firm's communications, internet, and media practice. He provides strategic, legal, and policy advice on a wide range of communications and spectrum policy issues to some of the world's largest and most dynamic communications network operators and equipment manufacturers, as well as industry trade associations and investors. Ari Fitzgerald. What's the big deal with 5G? I mean, Ari, you've been doing this a long time, so you're the perfect person to talk to about this. Why is 5G important? I remember we were talking a lot about 5G prior to COVID, and then COVID happened, and there have been so many other things happening with privacy and misinformation that, a lot of the discussion, we've kind of lost. We haven't talked about it as much. So, and by the way, I'm on Memorial Day. We're recording this on Memorial Day, and you guys may hear my kids in the back. So they say you're supposed to be authentic, so I guess this is authenticity.
Well, Joe, I'm really happy you're authentic. You asked a really good question. What's the big deal about 5G? Well, it's faster than 4G. It has better latency. In other words, it's better for latency-sensitive applications. A lot of people talk about connected car applications and the need to make sure that the data goes through as quickly as possible. People talk about gaming and how, over a 5G network, you'll be able to sort of play games in real time and there won't be a lag or jitter. So there are a lot of really exciting consumer applications that will probably be developed or ride over the 5G network. But there will also be a lot of exciting industrial or enterprise applications. A lot of people who are smarter than me talk about everything being connected over the 5G network, sensors everywhere. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it should be. There are efficiency gains that can be created when businesses connect their networks, whatever, and I'll give you an example, sort of an energy company, an energy provider that may have a break of a pipeline, a break in the pipeline. If there's a sensor on that pipeline, they'll be able to identify that break much more quickly. So you can think of a lot of, both consumer and enterprise or industrial applications. It's a faster network. It's lower latency, and depending on the spectrum band that's used, very high capacity.
Yeah, my youngest daughter plays a lot of games, and she's gonna love to hear about that. The thing is that she's been we've been giving her allowance, and she's been sending it to YouTubers. And and then she said, "Why are you sending this to YouTubers?" And she's like, "They need the money."
Some of them need the money.
Yeah, have you looked?
Some of them don't.
Yeah, and then I asked her if she's looked at how many views they have, and it's pretty clear they don't need the money. But what is it that how are so 4G, we're at capacity with 4G. Is that what you're saying? We need more capacity?
Well, yeah, I mean, 4G, 4G brought a lot of really interesting applications, right? I mean, we didn't have Uber before 4G. There are a lot of things that we weren't able to watch, I still don't do this that much, but watch Netflix over our smartphones before 4G. The 3G was a bit too slow. It took too long to download videos. Now it's a lot faster to download videos, but with 5G, it'll be even faster. I mean, experts are sort of saying, 5G will be somewhere between 8 and 10 times faster than 4G. Once fully deployed and once all of the spectrum that has been allocated that could be used for 5G is actually deployed. So we have a long way to go. And a lot of people who have 5G right now are probably thinking, well, I don't see a big difference between 5G and 4G. It depends on where you are and the spectrum that's being used. The millimeter wave spectrum, which is spectrum way up in the 28 to 31 gigahertz band. There's a lot of spectrum up there that has been made available to the mobile carriers. The signals there don't travel very far, so you may be sitting, if you're lucky enough to be sitting in a place where there is millimeter wave 5G, you can get really fast speeds up to even 1 gigabit per second. But when you move outside of that hotspot, you're sort of back on the 4G network or something that looks more or feels more like 4G. The network will get better as more and more spectrum gets deployed. So, you asked a really good question. Are we at capacity? The way I would answer that question is, people ask that question about 4G, the transition from 3G to 4G. And technically, I guess, we weren't really at capacity, but we didn't know we knew 4G would bring about really new and exciting applications. We didn't know what they would all be at the time, but we knew that if we built it, they would come. And I think that will happen with 5G as well. There'll be some things that we are not even talking about right now. There's been a lot of hype around 5G, I will admit, but there will be things that we aren't even talking about now that will be developed and provide a lot of benefit, to consumers, social welfare benefits to governments, help promote smart cities, all kinds of benefits once the 5G network is fully deployed, and I think we'll all, as I said, I think we will all benefit from that. We'll all benefit from those activities and that app development.
So tell us about how this works. What is spectrum? How is it allocated? And what is it that the FCC? How does the FCC get involved in that? And what is their role in figuring out whether we're going to be able to do all these things?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So I always start by telling people spectrum is a public resource. It's you and I own it. It's like public lands. And so, and it has to be managed, because if it wasn't managed properly, there'd be a lot of interference. Back in the early 1900s, people started using various frequency bands for communications, but there were no rules of the road. So people would just sort of use a frequency. Someone else would use a frequency in the vicinity and there'd be interference. Well, back in the 30s, the Congress realized there had to be some management. And so they created the FCC. And one of the purposes of the FCC, there were many, but one was to manage the spectrum. So the radio spectrum. So what is it? It's sort of the frequencies that are used. The FCC typically has authority to manage the radio spectrum all the way up to 300 gigahertz, what's called the radio spectrum. And it's the frequencies that are used by providers of a wide variety of services. Your television, you receive television reception over certain frequencies. You receive satellite reception over certain frequencies. Your cell phone, your cell phone operates over various radio frequencies. So the FCC typically allocates certain blocks of spectrum for specific services. And in the case of commercial wireless services, it's been auctioning rights to use the spectrum or licenses since the mid-1990s. Mobile carriers pay a lot of money for this stuff. The licenses tend to be carved up into geographic areas, and the licenses that are most valuable are the ones that cover, the largest population. There's a lot of politics that goes into how to carve up that spectrum. There's a lot of politics that goes into what types of restrictions to impose to make sure that no one party or no one party gets access to all of it, and that there will be enough spectrum allocated to multiple providers to make sure that there is adequate competition. There's a lot of debate about whether we have adequate competition now. I personally believe that, at least with respect to commercial mobile services, we have at least three nationwide providers that are vigorously competing against each other, and another one coming into the market, Dish, so that we do have, as consumers, we have some choice. We also have parties that use unlicensed spectrum, and that's some of the spectrum that the FCC makes available is unlicensed. It can be used by any party without having to go through the rigmarole of an FCC process, without having to pay for the right to use the spectrum.
And so that's the spectrum if I'm, saying, hey, Google, what's the weather today? Or if I use a wireless mic or a baby monitor.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And there's been a huge amount of economic activity and technological development that has sprung from the release of unlicensed spectrum as well. So I'm a booster of both. I do think that for certain services, especially where quality of service is important, the best way to go is to allocate and assign licensed spectrum, because that's the only way that you can assure yourself that you won't have harmful interference. The thing about unlicensed spectrum is it's sort of like the wild, wild west. Everyone is out there, sort of like what the communications landscape looked like before the Communications Act. Sort of everybody's out there. If you can build technology devices that are robust against interference, or can sort of sense when the spectrum that you want to use is open and free and available, then you're good. But if your device, your operations are not as robust against harmful interference, and you're using unlicensed spectrum, the quality of the service that you offer is degraded. So there are trade-offs with respect to spectrum policy. I worked at the FCC for almost 5 years. I live vicariously through the people who do, but I don't envy them. They often have to make really tough calls on these issues.
And that's a good segue into talking about access and coverage, which usually comes down to rural versus urban areas. And those are kind of proxies for, white versus people of color, even though rural areas comprise a number of people of color, whereas, hearing a lot about J.D. Vance running for Congress, and, some people are saying that his book only addresses, the rural from his perspective and his family's perspective, and kind of ignores communities of color.
Yeah, I take issue with that, because as someone who comes from a long line of Black farmers, people in my family, were farmers for 150 years at least. We can trace our family back to that. There are a lot of Black people, there are a lot of Latino people, there are a lot of Native American people in rural areas. And we do, when we think about rural, we have to think about them as well as low income whites and just basically people who live in rural areas who can be isolated if they don't have access to the latest technology.
And so how will 5G and current innovations, what do we need in rural, and then what do we need in urban areas?
Well, I think in rural, we need the same thing we need in urban. We need to connect everyone. And but it's more expensive. You just think about it from a business perspective. It's a lot more expensive to bring connectivity to places where very few people live or where the population density is not as great. Because if you're in the business of providing connectivity services, you want to put up your network where the most people, where the highest number of people live. It allows you to make the most amount of money. So many parts of our country, some of the most beautiful areas, would not be served without some type of subsidy, without some type of government subsidy. The market by itself would not result in the folks in those communities being served, but they need to be served. There's a government interest. This is one of those situations where there is what I call market failure, but there is a government, there's a public policy interest in making sure that they are served, because if people in rural areas don't have connectivity, they're cut off from the rest of us, people who are lucky enough to live in urban areas. And the rural-urban divide widens. They don't have as many economic opportunities. You see some of the repercussions of that today. So it's really important to provide connectivity to people in rural areas, but it costs more money. The government has to subsidize the provision of services to rural areas, including the provision of 5G, in my opinion. So how does the government do that? Well, we have these universal service programs, including various programs that are focused on providing subsidies to parties that want to provide services, wireless services, mobile services, such as 5G in rural areas. The FCC has, in recent years, conducted reverse auctions to determine what subsidies should be provided to these unserved areas. They use reverse auctions because they're trying to make the process of developing and awarding subsidies as efficient as possible. So the way it works is they award the subsidy to the lowest bidder. It's sort of, and they didn't always do it that way. They used to do it a different way, and they used to they used to use a lot of network models to determine what it actually costs to provide service in a particular area, and they try to do the best they could to estimate what the subsidy should be. A lot of people complained about that process as not being as efficient and as not taxpayer friendly as it should. So they've recently, started using reverse auctions. There have been some problems with reverse auctions, though. Also, the most recent reverse auction, which wasn't used to develop subsidies for 5G or wireless service, but for fixed service, the RDOF auction, unfortunately used data as to, what services were, what areas were unserved that wasn't very good, wasn't very accurate. And, the FCC ended up actually determining with that bad data that there were places right in the middle of downtown Chicago that were, quote, unserved, when everyone knows that, those areas were actually served. uh, but the FCC is now working, and I want to give a shout out to Chairwoman Rosenworcel, working very hard to develop better maps and better data as to where service exists and where the gaps are, so that the FCC and the government in general can do a much better job of, awarding subsidies where they need to be.
You're plugged into the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
And how does satellites come into play here? First of all, you were talking about spectrum before. Is that above the 300 limit that the FCC currently deals with, the 300 band? And tell us a little bit about that. I mean, we have Kuiper with Amazon. We've got Ericsson, I think, is getting into satellites. Microsoft.
There are a lot of really exciting satellite projects. No, the satellites are operating in frequencies that are within the radio spectrum, and they play a really important role, in my view. There have been, as you mentioned, Joe, there have been a lot of satellite constellations that have been launched and licensed and launched to provide mainly fixed broadband service. And they're using, most of them are what they call non-geostationary satellite LEO constellations, low Earth orbit. So these satellites, there are a lot of them. The industry has learned how to produce them more cheaply, but it's still an expensive, undertaking. So some of these satellite providers, for example, SpaceX, they want to launch thousands of these satellites, and they're going to be traversing the Earth in low Earth orbit. And they believe that they will be able to provide fixed broadband service at speeds that should be attractive to consumers, at a price point that should be attractive. I think a lot of people still believe that the main application for this type of broadband service, satellite-based broadband service, is in rural areas where you don't have the terrestrial, where it may be too expensive to deploy what they call a terrestrial network, wireline or wireless. And so, a lot of people believe that these satellite constellations will end up being mainly in rural areas or in very hard to serve areas, or areas that have topology challenges, like islands. But it's really great actually to see this activity in the satellite industry, because I do believe that if enough of these satellite projects are successful, that'll push the other providers of broadband to be more aggressive, hopefully affect pricing and, make the market more competitive. We will see. We'll have to see. I think there will be a role to play by satellite constellations, and, I don't know if all of them will be successful, but I believe some will.
Well, there are a lot of questions here, and we haven't even gotten to net neutrality. I mean, who knows what content creators are going to be able to do with with that additional spectrum, and whether the carriers are going to start pushing back again. Briefly, because I want to get to, letting folks know a little bit more about your background and how you moved through this, and, career advice for folks who are, no matter what stage of their career they're in. But what do you see as sort of, where do we stand with net neutrality? And we'll do it briefly because we did it for 10 or 15 years before. So I don't know.
Well, yeah, Joe, I mean, I feel like I've seen this, picture before. Where we stand right now is there are no net neutrality rules on the books. And that's because after the FCC under President Obama imposed net neutrality rules intended to ensure that content and application providers weren't going to be discriminated against by ISPs. The Trump administration removed those rules, so we don't have any. Now, the good news is, again, I'm going to be just totally honest with you. The good news is I haven't seen a lot of discrimination by ISPs in the marketplace against unaffiliated content providers. So, I don't know how you feel, but I haven't seen a lot of bad actors since the FCC lifted those net neutrality rules. That doesn't mean that it might not happen. There could be, but this pendulum swing. What happens is everyone anticipates that if the FCC ever gets a Democratic majority, there's been our president, the current president, took quite a long time to nominate his FCC chair and also to nominate the third Democrat that would serve on the FCC. If we ever get to a point, and right now the FCC is 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. If we ever got a third Democrat, most people believe that the FCC would then move to reinstate the Obama net neutrality rules. Whether we get that third Democrat remains to be seen. But what really should happen here is that Congress should pass a law that sort of sets what the rules should be for net neutrality, and not have those rules, those rules appear or disappear depending on who's in the White House.
So let's get to your
good news is thus far, at least since the Trump administration overturned the net neutrality rules, I haven't seen a lot of activity that I haven't seen a lot of discrimination. I haven't seen blocking of websites. I haven't seen some of the actions that some people predicted when the net neutrality rules were eliminated.
And there hasn't been a lot of advocacy, or as much that I've seen in my news feed, coming from a lot of the groups who.
No, but if the FCC ends up proposing to reinstate the net neutrality rules, there will be a lot of advocacy. And, it's in a way, people like me, lawyers, will continue to be able to put their children through college, because of this debate. I really believe, I'll be honest with you, Joe, I don't believe that's in the best interest of the American public. I think what Congress should do, Congress is sort of, abdicating its responsibility in some way. This is what happens when you get old. You just say what you believe. Congress should step in and set the rules. And I think both sides of the debate agree with this. Congress should set the rules so that we don't have to, so that businesses will know how to plan, consumers will know how to plan, app developers will know, what the rules are, what their rights are. That's what should happen. But do I think it's going to happen? No, I don't think it's going to happen.
And you've been doing this for a long time. I won't say you're old, but I will say you've been at the FCC, you've been at the White House, you've been at Hogan Lovells for many years, multinational law firm. Tell us about one piece of career advice that's kind of carried you through all of your escapades in working in Washington.
Boy, there've been a lot of, I've been given a lot of advice, and I've really appreciated the advice I've received. I have had so many mentors and sponsors in my career, and people who told me when they thought I was making mistakes, helped me when I made mistakes, helped me fix those mistakes, put me on the right path. But I'll tell you, the advice I probably have taken to heart the most is advice that was given to me by the judge I clerked for after law school. He's 94 years old. He's a Renaissance man. He's still alive. He's an amazing judge. And he always told me and the other clerks who work for him, you can learn from everyone you interact with. You can learn something. And that's turned out to be very true. If you are attuned, if you are open, you can learn from anyone, whether it's your kids, and you know this because you and I just talked about it, your kids, the person who greets you every day in the lobby when you come into the office, if you have an office, the people who, I have a lot of really, really smart young lawyers who work with me. I learn from them every day. I learn from so many people, and, you just have to be open. You have to be open to it. And I use what they tell me in my advocacy. My judge used to rely on his clerks quite a bit for the legal analysis. When we had opinions, we would draft his opinions. But when there was a really meaty constitutional issue that he was dealing with, he would always write an introduction to his opinions. And the introduction he wrote himself. So he would say, he'd call me into his office and say, Ari, I really like your analysis. I agree with it, but I'm going to write the introduction. And what he did in his introductions, he was writing for the common person. If it was a First Amendment issue, he just tried to present it in a way that the average person could understand, the average person who's not a lawyer. And one of the things that I have tried to do in my career, and I don't know whether I'm doing a good job of it, but I've tried. I know that I work in an area that's very complex, technically complex. But I have tried to, in my work, tried to make it meaningful to people who don't get into the weeds as much as I do, don't want to get into the weeds as much as I do, but for whom this is very important. I've tried as much as possible, and I've urged my colleagues to be as plain spoken as they can be. This is important. Telecommunications and tech is 1/6 of our economy, and everybody is affected by it. Everyone. We are all affected. We got to be able to talk about it in ways that allow everyone to understand. And Joe, one of the things that I really appreciate about what you do is that you're, actually doing that. You're talking about it in ways that make it easier for, folks who aren't in the weeds to understand.
Well, that's because when I talk about it at dinner parties and things, people would literally start falling asleep.
That is true.
So what are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us, some final takeaways before we close, and where can we find you online?
Well, I've really enjoyed this. I encourage everyone to just remain vigilant and just be attuned to, what's going on in the tech and telecom policy realm, because it does affect you. And how can you contact me? I mean, I'm the leader of the communications practice at Hogan Lovells, and I do quite a bit of. I try to do a lot of thought leadership. I write a lot, and so most of my writings on tech and telecom are available at our website, www.hoganlovells.com.
Ari Fitzgerald, partner at Hogan Lovells, where, like you said, he leads the firm's regulatory work in communications, internet, and media. Ari, thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Joe.
WashingTECH.